Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strategies for future-proofing privacy for healthcare. So today we have a very exciting and engaging lineup focused on the evolving landscape of healthcare privacy. So in this session, we would explore the key drivers between the increasing wave of healthcare regulation, including in the US and globally. Our discussion would also include an examination of the EU health data space, aimed at enhancing data sharing across the EU while respecting privacy rights. We would also be looking at the EU AI Act and focusing on how these regulations can shape the future of artificial intelligence in healthcare. On the US front, we will be discussing Executive Order 14117 and its implications for healthcare. And of course, we will discuss HIPAA, a cornerstone framework for privacy in the US, and the changes that we're expecting this year. Throughout this discussion, we would highlight strategies for future-proofing privacy in healthcare. Before we dive into the specifics of the legal landscape and the obligations, let's first take a look at what's driving the increase and the proliferation of healthcare privacy regulations. I will turn this over to Paul. Paul, from your perspective, what's driving this flood?
Thanks, Obi, for that question. One of the big issues that we continuously hear in the healthcare space, and particularly now, unfortunately, AI being used in a negative way in this situation, has made basically cybersecurity top of mind, right? And we're seeing a lot more ransomware than ever. Denial of service is pretty steady, but what is growing is the malware and ransomware. So the entire area of healthcare for the better part of the next 8 years, you're going to see a lot of focus in on ramping up our efforts in the cybersecurity area. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only driver. That is certainly a major player. There are a number of other drivers. There's 3 particular trends that Janelyn will talk through.
All right, thanks, Paul. So in terms of the 3 big trends, one of the things that we're seeing, and it's absolutely part of the reason we've got you all on the call today, is the growth of state level bills in order to be specifically focused in on health data as compared to maybe sort of privacy more broadly. And so the big one out there, of course, right now that is likened to Washington's My Health, My Data is the New York Health Information Privacy Act. Paul and I were laughing at the beginning when we were waiting for the call to start about the fact that New York had to co-opt HIPAA into their Privacy Act. But nonetheless, we're starting to see really a focus on consumer health as specifically called out separate from privacy more broadly when it comes to consumer data. And not surprising and completely aligned with that is also a focus on reproductive health more specifically. So we've got bills in California, Michigan, Hawaii, and Virginia that are directed towards even a more sort of, I would say, sensitive subset of health data, which we already know to be sensitive to begin with. And then the third trend, and I think this is one that will be very interesting to folks, given what we just saw on the polling, which is the fact that we are also starting to see states poke their heads up when it comes to addressing AI in healthcare services. So this is a little bit different than a pure privacy play, but it absolutely is that link between AI and health data, and particularly the ideas of the role that apps are going to play in ingesting our data, in processing our data, and certainly in thinking about how we look at a digitally based healthcare system that is emerging. And so what you see here are a range: New York, Nevada, South Carolina, Utah, Texas, where they're looking at bills that are going to be addressing chatbots or AI programming, or ways in which tech is actually representing itself as providing services that otherwise humans historically have provided. And I think there's a lot here to unpack, certainly. But really, when it comes to number 3, one of the things that struck me and continues to strike me as we look at the privacy landscape at the state level more broadly is that this is not a blue state only focus. So it's not a secret that we are particularly partisan at the moment. And you tend to see, and we have historically seen, things like privacy begin at a blue state and sort of a liberal agenda, but we are seeing it equally embraced on the conservative side. And so you're looking at, particularly in Section 3 over there, states that I would not have picked to be the movers and shakers on this topic, moving and shaking. Specifically, I would say Texas, and even to a degree, Nevada and Utah. So very interesting to see that we are going to see a continued fragmentation across the US landscape, continued pressure on organizations, particularly in healthcare and healthcare services, and also in that sort of ancillary atmosphere that is all of the healthcare apps that exist, or health-oriented apps out there, because we're starting to see each of these bills pluck at different aspects of the business model. And so I see Paul nodding. I would love to open this up to Paul and Marco to get perspective, particularly from Marco, because I know for global organizations, it is a perennial headache to deal with 50 US states and 50 different agendas. So, gentlemen, what can you add to this?
So I'll go ahead, Marco, and jump in. I think none of this comes as any surprise, right? We're seeing, these, as in number 1, right, these individual consumer health bills. Sometimes there's some addendums that are being added. I think all of us in the privacy space would rather see one document, right, with various subsections, rather than having another set of acronyms that we all have to try to figure out, memorize, and associate as we communicate with each other. The reproductive health, again, a lot of separate things happening there. But what really was of interest to me was exactly what Janlyn was just talking about, and it's just number 3. I don't know about you, but recently it wasn't a healthcare bot, but it was another type of bot in telecom that I was interacting with. And honestly, until it said we are now going to turn this over to a live agent, I thought I was talking to a live agent. The conversation and the ability to have what appears to be a natural conversation is being well generated by AI. So it does not surprise me that there is concern in the healthcare, particularly mental health, where you think you're talking to some mental health expert or professional, and yet you're talking to a machine, and the grave concern that generates. And I'll stop there and turn it over to Marco for any further comments.
No, I think that I fully agree with what just you said. And from our perspective, so for a manufacturer side, and probably you got the point that GE HealthCare is the company with the highest number of product or solution approved with embedded and AI technology approved by the FDA. It's something that we are facing a double situation. From one hand, is to continue improving and adopting and developing using such type of AI technologies is a way for us to improve at the end the patient outcome, and therefore we will continue more and more to adopt and to leverage this type of technology. But on the other aspect, we want even to strengthen the trust with our customers and the patient at the end, which means that whatever AI technologies we are developing, we need to ensure that is fully, let me say, in compliance not only with the regulation, but even to providing what is, or to overcome what is called as the black box. So we need to provide at the end to the users all the information that comes into the explainability and the transparency requirement in order to ensure an ethics usage of this type of solution and technologies.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, from a future-proofing perspective for the healthcare teams that are on the webinar listening in and starting to think about what needs to happen, I think Marco's point on the transparency and eliminating to the extent possible that black box perception is going to be a critical role that the privacy team will need to take. It is going to be very important to explain the data that's getting collected, the way in which it's being processed, how individuals are going to be able to be assured of their ability to get their data out, or how it's being used for training purposes. There are a number of different things, and we'll continue to touch on these as we go through, particularly when we even talk further on AI more specifically. But, you know, from a privacy program forward-looking perspective, my comments on this before we move on is to actually fall back on something that will come up on our HIPAA slide, which is looking back to good old-fashioned data mapping as a critical component here. It is going to feed into your DSARs, it's going to feed into your risk assessments, but at this point, what we see on this screen here is really clear that organizations that are dabbling or fully in this space better know where the data is, where it's going, and who it's being shared with. And so the more robust those, you know, ROPA Article 30 style reports are for the US market, the better off the program is going to wind up being. So with that, I think I'll send it over to Obi to take us to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Janalyn. It's interesting to see how AI use is evolving and how state regulations are also evolving along with it. So what happens when we zoom out and take a look at how federal policies and global privacy trends are shaping healthcare? How do they compare or complement? Paul, would you be able to explain more on that?
I think I need to put the caveat out there, and everyone knows what I'm going to say. And the caveat is, heading out of the Biden administration, these things were all in some level of consideration. Heading into the Trump administration, while we know number 4 in particular has moved forward, some of the other things were less understanding where the pulse is at the moment, right? We're going forward as though no change. And so therefore, the key trends, if there's no change afoot, is a continued or renewed focus on health apps. We've seen that in the past with the FTC. We're going to see more of that because just frankly, the volume of these apps showing up now and the pervasiveness they now have with our communities and with our populations in general, right? The other part is reinforcing from the OCR as well as the FTC that, remember, if you are doing some level of geolocation, do not encroach more than 1/3 of a mile in precision. So do not have, even though we all have the capability of come within whatever the nearest marker can be now, we, according to the FTC, can't get closer to 1/3 when it comes to the health arena and some of the other privacy areas, given some of the behavior that's occurred prior. The other thing is, we're seeing a lot of discussion at TrustArc, and I'm sure Marco and team are having internal discussions. And it comes down to this. The FTC has made it clear that in their viewpoint, there is no anonymous data left. What I mean by that is IP address in and of itself, while I don't know who exactly is identifiable on the other end, I certainly know that, that's the address of a computer. However, most often that information is not separated from other information. So if you put an IP address over the fence through, let's say, Google Analytics, and you're passing that over to Google, part of their ad suite, that's why you got Google Analytics for free, they are taking an IP address and reverse engineering that, right? They identify a profile associated with that. Now they're taking that they visited maybe your healthcare site or visited different areas on the site, and that is also tracked and being pushed over at the same time. You see where I'm going? You could begin to identify a whole lot of basic health related data tied to an IP address. So where am I going with this? If you have any type of trackers, particularly that are being shared with third party, like Google Analytics, out of the box does not have their privacy setting set. You have to change that on your own. If nothing else, make sure that you have the privacy setting turned on and you're not sharing IP address, device ID, MAC IDs, all those things with Google, because they are indeed viewed as data that is somewhat inferred or in more often than not considered personal data. The next item, number 4, we'll talk a little bit about. I'm going to hold on that, but it's basically a new focus. This is an executive order signed by Biden, and it has not been struck down by the Trump administration to date. And then number 5, right, as Jalen will talk through, cautiousness regarding whether or not we're going to move forward with this. But I do want to say there are some groups that are petitioning the Trump administration today, saying that to implement a lot of the things under HIPAA privacy and security rules in 25 or later, it would be an enormous regulatory burden and staggering costs associated with that. So those are at the federal level trends. We know that the other trend that we talked about was all about cybersecurity. You're now beginning to paint the lens, at least, of what keeps the US healthcare system up at night. Marco, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I think that, again, you touch one of the probably the most challenging part related to anonymization versus the identification. So, but I think that what I would like to add here on top of what, or in addition to what Paul just mentioned for with the US focus, I would like just to put on a table an opposing trends that we are seeing as when assessing the different regulation that are have impact on the healthcare sector specifically. So from one perspective, if we look at the EU space, we can see that the focus of the trend is to move in a direction in order to increase and strengthen the interoperability and collaboration. So regulation, or the aim of the common European data space, is exactly to try to, on a sector specific, and we will see later on what has been done on as part of the European health data space. But in any case, quite all the regulation that has been released in the last 1 year, 1.5 years in the EU space is something that move into the direction of, for sure, strengthen the cyber security related piece as they need to, or the getting the possibility even to the end users to get access to what is called the the data that is produced by the so-called connected products or services. So that means the Data Act, or the, as we discussed at the beginning, the artificial intelligence with the UI Act, which is the first a comprehensive framework to deal from development, deployment, and usage of AI technology. So all these regulation, we can say that in some way, in a different way, clearly, but moving into this type of direction. Even if we extend the scope and we look at the Apex site, so we can see that even the new global CBRP and the PRP is something that, again, has the aim to consolidate the framework, the certification framework that an organization can demonstrate compliance with, in order to transfer personal data across the globe in a secure way at the end. But on the opposite, there are some regulations, some countries, and I listed some of them into the slide, where for different purposes, for different reasons, one of them is, or the most common one is related to the fact that the health data has been considered more and more a national value data. They are willing to limit the location where the health data can be stored. Even in some countries, they are even imposing that the cloud service provider that are hosting, where we can host the health data, can be specifically qualified. So what we are seeing is exactly these opposing trends, from collaboration, increasing collaboration, but on the opposite side, maybe reducing this type of collaboration, enforcing this limitation on usage of new technologies like the cloud service provider, or either the hosting limit where the data can be stored. So if you move, for example, to the next slide, we can deep dive a bit on what is the aim of the recently released, because it's something that has been done very, very recently, the European Health Data Space. So the European health data space is probably the first one related to the healthcare sector that goes into the direction of building this type of common EU data space. So what is the aim? So the aim in this case is specifically related to individual, to the organization, and to the rest of the European Union. So from individual perspective, we can see that the European health data space is something that regulated and allowed and increase the access to the health delivery, so the primary use case, so in order to facilitate the health treatment when an individual is moving from one country to another. On the second aim is related to the secondary use of what is called secondary use of data, which means that the ensuring that when the data, the health data, is used for research, for innovation, the framework that is put in place is ensuring that a trustworthy the use of such type of data. And at the end, it's something that they are promoting to create these electronic health record systems that can be stored, where all the data can be stored, in order to strengthen even the cybersecurity protection of those data. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see some information about the path in the journey of this regulation, which is clearly as a very, let me say, interesting goal and aim. And this is something that cannot be done in just a few weeks or months or years. So it's a long journey, and this is something that is started, but the aim is to strictly correlate with the existing regulation.
Thank you, Marco. Another key piece of legislation is the EU AI Act. How does this act fit into the larger regulatory picture, particularly in relation to healthcare data privacy?
Yeah, So if you please go to the next slide, you can. I just tried to, because there are a lot of information. I think that a lot of webinar in the last months about the EU AI Act, and so I would like just to give you some heads up related to specifically what will be the implication for, again, the healthcare sector on the EU AI Act. So the framework, I believe that the participant is something that, even if I saw that the most interesting part is related to US law, but I believe that this is something that in any case, as soon as it is considered as the first comprehensive and framework regulation for the usage, development, and deployment of AI, is something that you are aware. So the most important approach, or the relevant approach introduced by EU AI Act, is to categorize the AI technology based on the risk for individuals. So we have what is called as an acceptable risk. And so this is something that is already in place, because starting from February this year, this is something that the AI technology that are considered as prohibited should be stopped to be deployed, to be used in EU, together with what is called the AI literacy, which is something that, again, goes into the direction that organization, in order to use, even to develop or just use AI technology, should be accountable to demonstrate that all employees that are be part or engaged into the usage or development of such type of AI technologies are properly trained. So this is one of the requirements that, again, is already enforced. On the other side, if we go back to the healthcare sector specifically, what is important is related to the category related to the high-risk systems. Is a common assessment that the medical device, per definition of the EU MDR, are considered as high-risk systems. Therefore, even if we have a time, which is end of or beginning of August 2027, but for manufacturer as GE Healthcare, this is, I can tell you, this is an incredible switch. This is a very challenging time and path, because we need to ensure that for that time, all our products will be able to be in compliance with all the requirements that for high risk are definitely higher compared to the limited risk, which is, again, in terms of transparency, explainability, everything. We need to go into the direction that, for sure, AI technologies can improve at the end the patient outcome, but we need to continue to demonstrate and provide that, starting from the design and the development of such type of technologies, we are able to demonstrate not only the transparency, not only that we take care of the biases, and this will open again another challenge for us, because, for example, during the development, if we go back to what Janalin said before, the usage of the data, we before, just for developing product, we don't need to get some sort of demographic data. Now, in order to demonstrate that we are building technologies that are fully compliant with the biases, we need even to take some sort of demographic data. So it's continuously challenging for us in order to try to have the right balance moving forward.
Thank you, Marco. That was very insightful, and you highlighted some important requirements that organizations need to think about. Let's turn our attention back to the US.
Actually, Obi, before we move on, I think that there's some thoughts here that I have anyway, and I'm sure that Paul also does. No worries. I have no problem stepping in and interrupting the flow here. But I think that, so when we take this back also to thinking about future-proofing the privacy program and thinking about how AI is folding in on the healthcare side, when you start to think about your AI risk assessments, and even predating that, your AI use case assessments, really start to think about that information collection in light of not only AI, but also your privacy program and also other kinds of federal regs or best practices that would be out there if you are fully square within the sights of something like HIPAA, where you are a covered entity or a business associate. Or again, if you are in that sort of gray area that these state laws are attempting to govern, which would be apps and platforms and solutions that collect health data that is not defined as PHI and that does not render you as a business associate or covered entity. So something that I'm sure we don't need to preach to the group is how narrow those definitions are. So many more organizations really do collect health data than would be PHI or covered. And so when you think about how you're going to integrate in AI and how you're going to evaluate to make sure that you are able to actually, I would say, sort of prove your operationalization against the pyramid here on Marco's slide, is really thinking about how you're going to identify and measure risk and be able to maintain that line of sight on the risk, because it is probably going to rise and fall depending upon how the AI model itself starts to evolve, depending upon data that you may, as Marco is indicating, some data you might need to collect up front, but it might not be collected in perpetuity. So it might be data that's then subsequently not needed. So really, when you're thinking about what to do here, it's a drum that I'm going to beat a few more times before we end the call, I promise. Data mapping, really understanding what is happening with respect to your processing, and then thinking about those PIAs or DPIAs or whatever side of AI impact assessment. There's new acronyms galore with respect to that. But when you're thinking about the assessments that you're building, do not think of them as point in time, dusty, almost, virtual, but nonetheless sort of like paper things where you have filled it out and it is filed and it is put on a shelf and forgotten about, because it's too dynamic. And there are too many different places that are going to attempt to govern the data processing operations, including within an organization in terms of your information security team, your operations team, your C-suite, and even above that, odds are good, your board of directors. So there's too many different slices and views from too many audiences to have this be a static type of program component. And so I think that's really something that is going to fall heavily on privacy teams who have by and large inherited AI governance, to think about how it is that you're going to be able to identify, but then really sort of actively track and keep an eye on when it comes to risk, and specifically when it comes to how data is being used within the AI paradigm. Paul, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that before we
No, I think, Janelyn and Marco, you both did a great job covering this area and reinforcing the tried and true, right? That we know AI exists, that it is going to continue to expand. It is not the sky is falling. We have principles, whether they're OECD or generally accepted privacy principles, right? There's all these different frameworks and principles. We just need to implement them. Because the AI is not outside of any of those, right? Need to have the transparency, need to know what we're doing with this information. How is it being trained? You got to be able to be prepared to answer those questions that you're going to get answered or asked by any authority who's kind of going into the details and trying to understand what happened. One of the big things, and then we can move on, is, to me, AI, this is a moment in time where the principles of privacy by design that Dr. Ann Cavokian put in place or envisioned in 1995 really should be highlighted, in my opinion, because what she was talking about is so relevant with AI. And the idea is particularly number 3, where we talk about building with privacy in our design phase. That's the critical. How do we get our organizations to talk together up front before we start down the road and start asking the question, hey, is there any personal data, health data, or whatever being collected? If so, that's when the privacy, compliance, security teams need to weigh in. But I really think that the sky isn't fallen. We have the tools to do this. We just need to implement them.
Okay, so thanks, Paul. And let's move to the next slide, please. Okay,
Yes.
so we are turning our attention back to the US. And Paul, can you walk us through this executive order?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Lee. A lot of stuff here. The good news is you guys will get a copy of this deck and you'll at least have it in your hands. So if you weren't familiar with, this is a fairly large scale executive order 14117 that was signed by President Biden a little over a year ago. The big summary of this is this executive order is really intended to deal with national security issues. And the quick summary therefore is to prohibit and restrict certain bulk sensitive, including healthcare, personal data transactions with specific countries of concern. Those countries of concern, I don't think it goes without saying, China, including Hong Kong and Macau, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. Those are the countries of concern. Now, a lot of us aren't doing that business anyway, but there's even more heightened nervousness, particularly with the sharing of this data across borders. The executive oversight for this executive order is the Department of Justice. Again, I want to state that this has continued unabated with the transition of administrations. They have done finished up the rulemaking under the Trump administration and so forth. So what will happen as far as the enforcement dates as we get closer to that, all of us will wait to be seen. But right now, it seems it's moving forward unabated. A couple of things that came out of the DOJ actions and the rulemaking. Covered persons, they identified, what are we talking about here? If you as an individual or your group is working directly or indirectly with one of those countries of concern, and that is defined as having 50% or plus interest, being an employee or contractor, being a resident, or any person deemed by the DOJ as an entity that is considered associate with the countries of concern. So these are who they are focusing in on and the actions being done by these covered persons. There's 2 types of covered data: US sensitive, which means that's where the bulk of like our healthcare and financial and all those types of things are concerned. The other thing is anything that is associated with the US government and the data that is produced by the US government. So think for a minute, in the US, we have social security numbers, we have passports, think government related data that way. Now, there are 6 categories of data and thresholds. And the first one, humanomic right? I guess is the term officially used now. That was new to me, but everything in the genome space, if you will. And what you'll see here is the thresholds are rather low. They're not very high. So if you're talking about transferring data of 1,000 people, that could be very easily, right, someone in a mid-size, business. And if you're in some way sharing that, particularly I'm thinking of China and a lot of joint ventures that are done there, the sharing of that information of those individuals, 1,000 or more, is an issue. Biometric, 1,000 or more. Precise location, again, we see that coming up more and more. 1,000 or more devices in this situation. Personal health, 10,000 or plus. Financial, a little higher, 100,000. And then any impersonal identifiers, 100,000 persons. So again, what this was primarily focused in on was to develop, there was a concern by the Biden administration at the time that AI capabilities and the use of these large data sets in ways that could be detrimental to the US national security. So whether it's a blackmail, espionage, anything like that, if they can take and use that in a way to hold someone, in a blackmail situation, we'll take that one. That's becoming an area of focus under Executive Order 14117. The most of these 6 categories of data and the thresholds, the enforcement period is just a couple of weeks away in April, where the bulk or the full breadth of the order won't be until October of 2025. So again, this is moving forward unless we hear differently in the coming weeks. If I can go to the next slide real quickly. I don't want to belabor this too much. You'll see a list of exemptions there. I'm not going to read that to you, but you'll see that. But I think the next actions to be done before October 6 are critical. And you're going to see the same things Janelyn just talked about, right? You need to know what's flowing in and out of your organization, right? So a data inventory mapping. And one of the things I want to emphasize, if you are hearing or you find yourself saying, I just need to get this data inventory done, I just need to check a box, that's not what we're looking for here. Data inventories are living documents. So what does that mean? It's got to be built into your network and your normal operations of things. So take the sting out of all this of thinking you got to redo these things every 2 years or whatever. Think about figuring out how these things get done today. And can you use some other way or tools or software, or whatever, to continue to keep it fresh and current? So that's number one. Number two, no surprise, data compliance security policies are requirements under this. The one that is of concern for a lot is an independent audit. Independent audit that needs to produce a written report that includes 10 years of retention. That audit needs to have a methodology, effectiveness, vulnerabilities, where things have failed, and areas of improvement. And there is a whole list of specifics found under those security requirements that are produced by the Cyber Security and Information Administration or agency of the US government. So that link there will take you to the document that outlines the specifics of what this audit needs to entail. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Paul. Janelyn, Marco, anything to add before we move to HIPAA?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So Janelyn, can you please take us through some of the changes that we're expecting from HIPAA?
Absolutely. All right, so we've got another jam-packed slide here, everyone, but I think that what's important to understand, and certainly again, if folks are in, if we've got attendees predominantly from the healthcare space, this is something that's on your radar. This is the first series of updates that we're seeing, particularly to the security rule, in more than 10 years. So to say that we are well past overdue for this is a dramatic understatement. But essentially, we're still in the rulemaking. So this will come with the other caveat that the same caveat rather that Paul mentioned, which is it is hard to say exactly what this current administration is going to do. However, what we're seeing in the proposed changes to the rule are really not so earth-shatteringly different than things that we've seen happen before. So perhaps there is a good chance that this is going to wind up happening. But fundamentally, same framework in place. There's the privacy rule, the security rule, and the breach notification rule. Those are the three rules that make up HIPAA. From a compliance perspective, we've obviously got the enforcement rule, but that's not for us on this call. There are some changes to the privacy rule that have been floated. None of them are really all that dramatic. We're talking about really, I think the one that would impact businesses the most is a shrinking by half, actually. It's the first bullet there over on the left-hand side, but the maximum time to provide access to individuals if they make a request to access their PHI goes from 30 days to 15 days. So that's a pretty aggressive shrink. And that would be something for organizations to keep an eye on. Otherwise, the things that we're seeing really aren't all that dramatically different. However, it is on the right side of the screen where we are going to start to see the burden that was referenced on the earlier slide in terms of what this means for an organization. And I will intercede on that concept of this being an unacceptable burden for organizations, because the things that we see here are, in my humble opinion, table stakes for protecting data. And what we do know that HIPAA is, it is the regulation that covers health data within the healthcare system. This data must be protected. And we also know that from the slide that Paul showed at the very beginning, but just from recent headlines, that this is a market that is being significantly targeted for all sorts of cyber attack. So the requirements are extensive, but the bottom line is what this looks like really. For those of you who are sort of generalists out there, this looks a whole lot like the safeguards rule updates to the GLBA that happened back in May of last year. So again, table stakes types of things, but a much more proactive, much more on top of the program perspective for what security teams are going to be expected to do. I do have an eye on the time here, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I do know that from the poll at the beginning, there is some concerns about vendor and vendor management. You'll see the bottom bullet down there, business associate oversight. There is absolutely an uptick in acknowledgement that the entire ecosystem has responsibility. And so it's not just a set it and forget it. Oh, my business associate signed a BAA and we're good to go, and it's their problem, not mine. So something to keep in mind. And so for any of you guys that are HIPAA covered, definitely start to drill in on this, because it will absolutely bring a greater focus and really opportunity for privacy to collaborate with information security to make sure that these kinds of things are in place for regulatory compliance.
Can you elaborate on how FTC, OCRO, and HHS view masked IP addresses?
So how they can, what IP addresses? I'm sorry, just
Masked IP I'm just going to read the question in full. So Paul spoke about Google Analytics plus IP addresses. Google Analytics marks the last octet of the IP addresses.
Got it.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of discussion about whether you want to call that hashing or whatever type of thing. There's a lot of if you will, ambiguity around that. Is that enough or whatever? I want to say there's some recent blog postings from the FTC that get into hashtagging or pseudonymization is not enough. So I would caution on use and thinking that just because I only show a portion of whatever that is, that is okay, versus creating something that may be, totally unique for tracking purposes. The big thing here, the big takeaway is if you're using Google Analytics, make sure you really understand what is being passed across to Google or any third party. We've seen some discussions and some fines come about with the Meta Pixel and the social media. It's in the same type of vein, right? People don't know that information is being passed. And we need to do a better job of disclosing that, and where possible, not pass information that big tech can take and create identities from.
Thank you, Paul. To our speakers, any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Thanks for participating and attending the call with us. We look forward to any follow-up questions that anybody might have. And I definitely want to thank Marco and Paul for a really interesting hour together.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining the webinar.
Thank you. Have
Bye.
a great day.